Hello, my name is Maria Clara, and I'd like to first thank the organizers for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys and to talk a little bit about how to write medical manuscripts and research manuscripts. And I'll start with this title of the presentation, which is called Medical Publishing, How to Write. We all have stories to tell. I think nowadays the concepts of inclusion, equality, and justice have become priorities also in research. So coming from Latin America, we have to acknowledge that we also do have very important stories to tell in terms of medicine, in terms of radiology, and especially pediatric radiology. So I'll start with saying, of course, that I have absolutely no conflicts of interest in this presentation. And then I'll start with this phrase from Donald Halstead, which is a professor in Harvard School of Public Health. I watched one of his presentations in 2018, and it was about how to write research manuscripts as well. And he started his presentation with this very interesting phrase. He said, in order for you to be a successful researcher, you need to be first and also a professional writer. And then when I read that, I was like, well, there's not really much to look forward to. In my case, I'm definitely not even a professional writer, not in Portuguese, let alone in English. So I was quite taken aback. I was, a little bit unenthusiastic when I first heard. But then when you watch the full presentation, you realize what he actually means by professional writer. So it's all about how you communicate. So we must understand that we're trying to tell a story through our manuscripts. So we need to be a professional writer in that sense. We must communicate to a broad audience. We must present it in a critical, as a critical argument. And what he said, and I thought was really interesting, was that if you want our work to be memorable and to have impact, we should present it as a story. So that's one of the best ways to actually convey information, even now in this modern world that we live in. So I'll start also with this blank page, which for me at least is one of the scariest figures ever. Like now it's better, but at first it can be quite frightening when you have to first start actually putting in words what you've already kind of collected in terms of data and analysis. So the aims of this presentation is actually, I do hope by the end of it, we will see this blank page with less fear and more enthusiasm, hopefully. So I hope to offer practical suggestions and a step-by-step guide for achieving success when writing manuscripts. And we will outline the main sections that an average article should contain and their main elements as well, and some tips to making the overall article more attractive. So we should keep in mind that we will start discussing a little bit about what to think about before writing and what it means to actually start writing. So in terms of what we should do first, so first things first, we should absolutely define our hypothesis and our objectives. This is paramount. Like if we're in the stage where we're going to write, we're assuming we have already established well what is our research question and what are our hypotheses and objectives. We should definitely have also broad knowledge of the literature. So in order for us to actually find the knowledge gap and formulate a hypothesis, we must be aware and on top of things in terms of what has been published in the last few years. So let's see, are we really ready to write? We must first think, what are the things we think before we actually put our pen down or our hands down, let's say. We should first choose the type of article. We should then be careful to follow the guidelines and checklists. It always pays off to look at it first, so you don't have to do the work twice. Trust me, I've done that multiple times. So just try to follow it from scratch. No, don't try to adjust it later on. Just start doing things right. It pays off in the end. And then also choose the target journals, at least a couple of them. That's also helpful. And also follow the journal's guide for authors as well, not just the guidelines for depending on which type of article you choose, but actually the journal's specific guide. So specifically, in terms of choosing the right type of article, so we must first define, is it what we're writing, we're going to write just one or more papers? That's actually really important. Sometimes we start writing one and then we divide, and then we try to present it as two different articles. It can get quite messy. So we should first decide it beforehand how many articles it's actually going to be. We have a tendency of trying to kind of put multiple questions into a single article, and then kind of trying to make it look more robust or full of interesting things. But in the end, what we realized is actually much easier to get published when we have a very, very specific and single research question. So in general, it pays off to be simple and straightforward instead of merging together multiple research questions. And what is the right format you want to convey your message, right? So is it a very like thorough article? So is it an original article, a complete one? Or is it just a short communication where you just are presenting like very early results, but you find them so interesting you can just wait to get them published? So sometimes when you find very interesting results, it pays off to kind of try to publish it fast, and you can just publish it as a short communication instead of an original article. Or is it a review where you're actually trying to kind of summarize and all that has been published so far and actually point out the gaps in the literature for future publication? So that's something to have in mind before you actually start writing. In terms of guidelines and checklists, that's extremely important. So depending on the type of article you actually intend to write, there are several guidelines, reporting guidelines that have been developed and validated. And especially high impact journals, they actually expect you to follow those. And they even ask you to upload the checklists. So if you're writing, for instance, a systematic review, you should keep in mind that the Prisma guideline also has a checklist. And you may need to submit the checklist with the respective pages where you can, pages and lines maybe, where you can actually find each information. So it really does pay off to look at this before, because once you've written your systematic review, for which you have to go back and do that, it can be quite labor intensive and time consuming. It's definitely not worth it. So if you're writing a systematic review, you do the Prisma guideline. If you're writing like a more observational study, it will be the strobe. And the study is for diagnostic studies. So depending on the type of each one of the manuscript you're actually writing, you have to follow different guidelines from scratch, ideally. And also it's important to keep in mind that clinical trials and systematic reviews must be registered in online databases. So that's a kind of a way to avoid people kind of studying the same thing at the same time. So it pays off when you know if someone has already started doing precisely what you're doing, to avoid duplicating results. So, but it's important to know that beforehand, because you should register your studies before you actually start collecting the data, ideally, and definitely before you start writing them. So it's something to keep in mind as well. And what about choosing the target journal? That's actually one of the hardest things, I would say. But we should definitely begin with the end in mind. So before we're actually writing, you should keep in mind at least 2 or 3 journals where we intend to submit, because that would definitely give us a head start in terms of the formatting of the manuscript. So how to decide the target journal, right? So we should first have in mind, what is the right audience? Who would care about our findings, right? So we should look at the scope and the format of each journal. We should think about the audience. It pays off to ask mentors and senior researchers and colleagues. They definitely, in general, they have more experience and they will be able to give to provide nice suggestions. It's also interesting to look at your references. Sometimes there are some journals that actually like a specific topic. So sometimes in that same kind of imaging technique can be published in more of in more frequently in this specific journal than in others. So it's interesting to look at your references as well. It can also be useful to look at the recent issues from candidate journals, so you can have an idea of what kind of topics they are more interested in. And you should also consider the rejection rates, right? So how likely it is for you to kind of succeed in publishing in a high impact journal. And also, what will be the consequences of a wrong decision, right? If your results, if it's unlikely other groups are studying exactly the same thing as you, then it should not, it doesn't hurt to aim high and take longer to publish. But if you're actually afraid to lose the timing, then it might pay off to go a little bit in a lower impact journal, but kind of get it out faster. So what about the journal's guide for authors, right? So that's kind of, I have to do that's very boring, right? So you have to kind of look all the formatting criteria, and it's definitely not, can be painful. I agree and acknowledge that, but if you do that beforehand, you just save yourself so much more pain later on. So after you select the kind of 2 or 3 journals, or maybe a little more at which you expect to submit your papers, you should just start reading the guidelines for authors very carefully, and you should just apply their instructions on the first draft beforehand. So just look at the layouts, how many references, what kind of references, how is the referencing style they suggest, the abbreviations, what are the criteria for the figures and tables. So having that in mind, it's just beforehand, is just really, really useful. And this will also save time from the editors, and it will make them happier and more likely to accept your manuscript as well. So let's finally write, right? So let's frame a scientific paper. We all know this is usually the order, right? Where we read journals in general. So we start with the title, the abstract, introduction, the methods, the results, the discussion. We end with conclusion, and then there are the references and the tables and the figures. Of course, the figures and tables can go mixed inside, of course. But in terms of submission, when we submit, this is the usual order, right? So it definitely doesn't necessarily mean that you have to write in this order, right? So we should first have in mind that the structure of a scientific paper, what I find very useful is to think of it as an hourglass, right? So you start with the introduction, which should be very broad, and then you narrow it down with the knowledge cap, and then you actually present your hypothesis and your question, right? The research question, what you're aiming to discuss, and then you present your results, and then in the discussion section, you actually talk about how your results actually apply in the more broad research world, right? So what you want to do is, like, you start broad, you narrow it down with the research question and the results, and then you go broad again, trying to see how your results impact clinical and the clinical and the research field in general. So it's all about this hourglass distribution. I find it really helpful to have that in mind when writing a manuscript. So where do I start? So it doesn't, like I said before, it doesn't necessarily mean you should follow that. I actually suggest you don't follow that. You follow your own style, what makes sense to you. I will present some of the suggestions I found in the literature and some of the suggestions that have worked for me so far. But please feel free to see what makes sense for you and what works best for you. So this is kind of a little bit messy, but in general, we should try to start with the figures and the tables, and then the methods. So the first part we actually write should be the methods, right? And then the results, and then the introduction or the discussion. That depends on your style. I prefer to start the discussion because I find that the discussion is very helpful in the end for you to write the discussion part. So it's actually when you go back to what you introduced in the introduction and discuss in the discussion. So it's like, I find it's like they are complementing, right, each other. So I prefer to start with the introduction, but it's very personal. You can also just go discussion, then introduction. And then you end with the conclusion, the abstract, the title, and then the references. So let's start. First, it's also helpful to have in mind what kind of question you're trying to answer within each section of your manuscript, right? So with the methods part, you're going to state what you did. In the results part, you're going to state what you found. In the introduction, you're going to say why you did it. And in the discussion, you're going to actually analyze what it means, right? So that's also helpful to have that in mind. So I'm going to try to give like a practical view of each one of the sections. And for that, I'm going to use this article published in Pediatric Radiologist in 2021. It's an article on multiparametric cardiac magnetic resonance imaging in pediatric and adolescent patients with acute myocarditis. So we're going to use this article as kind of an example of each one of these sections. So let's start with the figures, right? So the figures, they should be, they have a very, very useful source of data, especially when what you want to convey is very complex for, and especially for description. So if we say that a figure or a photo like means 1,000 words, right? So it's all about, whenever it's too hard for you to put that in words, you should definitely put that in figures. And for us as radiologists, we have a tendency of using, I would say, a lot of figures. So try to do that. So use figures whenever it's too complex to put into words. Also, it's nice to show relationships and trends using figures as well. It makes the relationship more clear, right? To actually present it in figures or graphs instead of just R squares or betas or p values and so on. So it's definitely useful also for relationships and trends. Try not to repeat data that is in text. So you're actually trying to save space from the text with figures and tables. So if you start repeating them, it just doesn't make sense, and it's kind of frowned upon. In general, people don't like to read what they've just seen, right? And another thing to keep in mind is that appearances do matter. So make the pictures and the figures beautiful, right? So avoid crowded plots, just adjust the axis labels and the sizes. So it should be pretty, it should be appealing to the reader. And also, it's important to keep in mind to avoid colors whenever possible, especially because they can be quite expensive. So I didn't know that at first when I was first writing like my first article, but most journals actually charge another fee if you're actually using colors in figures. So it pays off sometimes to choose substitute colors using like dashed lines or full lines and so on. So it's another way to kind of avoid even more fees. So moving on to the tables. The tables, it should be used especially for baseline characteristics. So like that's the usual table one from every manuscript, right? It's like the baseline characteristics from the population, and if you're working with a case control trial study, it's usually the two groups you're comparing each other. So definitely for baseline characteristics, for outcomes and treatments as well, and for comparing two or more groups, that's very, very, very useful. It's also important to use tables to provide only the most important results. You don't want to put everything into tables, but if you do that, you should keep in mind that you can put them in the supplementary material as well. But also, please always check beforehand the number of tables in the author guidelines so that you avoid like all the trouble of going through making several tables that cannot be used in the end because of the limits. But you have in mind that you can leave the long boring tables to the supplementary material as well. So it's another option. So let's go to the methods for it. So the methods is like we mentioned before, it's all about what you did, right? So it should be like detailed, like a cookbook. You expect readers to be able to reproduce your work with their own population just by following your instructions. So that's how detailed and how thorough you should be in your methods section. You should start with the study design. So you should state the IRB approval in the consent form. You should state the type of study. Is it prospective? Is it retrospective? The type of sampling, was it random? Was it consecutive? And also define your inclusion and exclusion criteria, right? and also follow your full short or recruitment as well. That can be also useful as you do one. Also, that's as radiologists, we will of course define the imaging techniques. So we will give a very thorough, detailed description on how the imaging data was acquired. So we will use we will describe the type of imaging device, the manufacturer, the imaging parameters, and finally the type and the amount of and the administration of contrast agent. You can also just use a table for that. That will save you several lines as well. And then finally, you're gonna state how you analyze your images, right? How who performed the analysis, how experienced they were they blinded or not? You're gonna define very clearly your criteria. If you're assessing reliability or validity, let's say reliability in terms of inter or interoperability, you should state that you're gonna do that and how you're gonna do that in the method section. And if you're comparing against the reference standard, you should also make it clear in the method section. And finally, you should end your method section with a paragraph describing your statistical analysis, the level of significance for p-values, and whether or not you use correction for multiple comparisons, for instance, and of course, the statistical software you used. This is also important, right? So you should, sometimes we don't know which verb tense we should use depending on the section of the article. So I find that's also very helpful to learn that in the method section, we usually use just the past tense. So we usually say we measured, we tested, we recorded, we analyzed, and so on. It's usually in the past, so that's important to keep in mind. So let's read this part together. So that's from that article that I mentioned at first, that we're going to use as an example. So they start their method section with the first paragraph, where they say it's a retrospective case control study approved by the ethics committee, and within an informed consent form was waived. They say how they define clinically acute myocarditis, how they define the controls, and where were the exclusion criteria. So this is all about the study design and the subjects, right? This first paragraph. So it's really following that kind of guideline that I discussed with you in the previous slides. And on the second paragraph, they give a very detailed overview of the imaging technique. So they say the manufacturer, the MRI scanner, all the details in the protocols, and also they provide even more details in the supplementary material as well. So this is all about the imaging technique. And then on the third paragraph of the methods, they say who analyzed the images, how experienced they were, what software they used for imaging analysis, what was the methods that were used, how they rated, how consensus was achieved. So this is all about how the imaging was actually analyzed. And then finally, the end with the statistical analysis paragraph, where they give a very detailed assessment on the test they used, and also, of course, on which statistical software they employed, and of course, the statistical significance level. So this is all about the last paragraph, the statistical analysis. So you see how it looks, it's like a cookbook, right? So this is all kind of everything you should keep in your method section. So let's move on to the results section. So the results section is all about what you found, right? So you should present the experimental results you found. Either they may prove or disprove your hypothesis, but you should stick to your aims when describing them, right? So you should present your results trying to do that in a similar order as the method section. You can also use subtitles as in the method section, and you can keep them in the same order. It's very helpful as well. It should be an objective report, right? So we have a tendency to already put in sometimes in the results like, oh, it's really interesting, we found that, or surprising, we observed that. We should avoid this, right? So in the results section, we should try to be as unbiased as possible. We should just be very, very objective and just state what you found. You're going to discuss and analyze and actually put your opinions into it in the discussion section, but in the results section, it's not for that. We should try to be objective. We should also try to keep in mind that The results can be presented either as text or imaging, examples, graphs, diagrams, tables, and so on. Just keep in mind to avoid, if you present it in the table, avoid putting it also into the text. Should avoid being repetitive. And also keep in mind that content and interest, they vary a lot in terms of what sort of technique you use, right? As text or a table or graph or illustration. So illustrations are usually very, they're more interesting than texts. The texts actually kind of convey a lot of content, kind of like as tables. So it depends on what you're actually trying to translate. You're going to use different kind of methods, right? And then finally, you're going to try to also follow these steps. So first with the descriptive statistics, and then with your procedural results. And then if you analyze validity and reliability of your results, you should put that in the end as well. So we're going to look into an example together to see if it becomes clear. But also keep in mind that the verb tense for the results section is also the past tense. So for instance, the first paragraph of that article results section, it's called general characteristics. So they state how many subjects they analyze, how many males, how many patients had the disease, and then they say that all that information, actually much more than that information, is also present in table 1. So table 1's usually the first, is usually cited in the first paragraph of the discussion, right? And it's all about the descriptive statistics. In the second paragraph, what we see in second, third, and so on, we see a section called, a paragraph called cardiac magnetic resonance imaging results, diagnostic performance, cardiac magnetic resonance follow-up. So this is all the results, each analysis that was run, it's presented in with a different subtitle. And this is all the procedural results, right? So those are actually your results, what sort of analysis you ran and what you obtained, right? And then moving forward, so in this particular example, they did not investigate validity and reliability, so they did not put that in the results. But you can, if you do that, if you investigate inter-race or inter-river reliability, or if you investigated, if you compared your results with the gold standard, for instance, you should put that also in the results section. So moving on to the introduction, which is my favorite part. I love writing introduction. I find it the best part to write. You're actually going to explain why you did what you did, right? So it's kind of that moment where you have to try and be a salesperson in a way. You have to convince, you have to sell your idea, you have to be productive, you have to show knowledge and understanding, you have to show that you know what you're doing. And you also, I think the dream of every writer that's writing an introduction is that the readers, when they read your introduction, they will think, how come I didn't think of that? So that's kind of what you're aiming for, right? So to be very, very productive and make it very appealing for the reader. So you're gonna start your introduction with a statement of the issue, right? You're gonna say what is the relevance of what you're studying. So why is this what is the importance of this research topic? You're gonna talk a little bit about the background of the disease. You're gonna explain the importance of the imaging in this context. And then you're going to move forward to the originality paragraph, right? So you're going to state why you need that study, what is the gap, what you're trying to answer, right? So you're going to give an overview of the imaging methods used to address this issue. It's important to reference the major publications in the topics. And you're, of course, going to introduce the knowledge gap, the unmet need, the clinical or technical dilemma in this second paragraph in general. And then finally, you're going to end your introduction with your purpose, right? What is the hypothesis you want to test? What is the rationale? You're going to provide clearly the research question with the hypothesis and the objectives as well. And finally, you're going to end the sentence on the purpose of your study, which should be very similar to the one in the abstract as well. So this, when you think about introduction, it's kind of like what we discussed before, the hourglass, which should be kind of an upside down triangle, where you're going to start very broad with the what is the relevance, what is known, what is the background. You're going to move, start narrowing it down with the originality paragraph, where you're going to say what is not known. You're going to introduce the gap. You're going use the word however or nonetheless and so on. So you're going to use a transitional device to actually say what is the knowledge gap. So that's very interesting, because once you become familiar with this transitional devices, right, like with these words or phrases that actually introduce the knowledge gap, when you read any paper, you're going to find the research question or the knowledge gap very fast, because it's very monotonous. It's like everybody kind of uses very, very similar phrases. But it's also helpful because you can find them whenever you want. So you can use like something like, it remains unknown whether something or something. You can say, to date, it has not been proven. You can say, no study to date has investigated the effect of something. There are few data to quantify something. The effect of something on another thing remains unclear. So there are multiple ways where you can actually introduce the knowledge gap. But in general, these are the most used ones. And then after you do that, you should state your purpose and how you're going to respond to that gap, right? So you being aware of that gap, how do you want to address it, right? So you're going to put like something like therefore with that in mind and so on. So we hypothesize that the administration of something would reduce or do something in this context. We aim to assess, to evaluate something through a perspective or an observational study, something we aim to do that and so on. So there are these very, very kind of well-established phrases or specific words that you should actually very, very much keep in mind to use commonly in your papers. Remember that the lack of, this is very interesting, the lack of a clearly stated research question is the most common reason for rejection. So we should make it clear in the introduction what is it that we're actually trying to answer, right? So this hypothesis, it must be very easily identifiable, right? And this is also very important. So this is from an article as well. It says you should not worry about being unoriginal, right? So I mentioned it's very kind of very monotonous. So you can realize that not most people, but a lot of researchers use very similar lines, and that's not a bad thing at all. I know that we're trying to tell a story here, but that doesn't mean that we need to be that creative, you know? So we should kind of try to keep it simple and keep it direct, especially because a busy reviewer, they will want to find your research question and your purpose and so on very fast. They don't have time to waste. So that also helps with the revision process. And these are also in this table examples of well-stated purposes for different types of submission. So depending on the type of article you're writing, you can use different lines to introduce your purpose as well. So these are examples from the literature. And I'm now approaching the verb tenses for the introduction. It all depends on your aim, right? So it all depends on the paragraph you're actually writing. Oops, sorry. So if you're trying to describe a current state of knowledge, you're going to use the present, but if you're writing to formulate an objective, you use the past tense. So it all depends on what you're actually trying to convey. So that's actually a little bit different from the methods and results, which is much easier because we just use the past tense. So in the introduction, you should keep in mind exactly what you're trying to say. So let's go through the introduction from that paper we discussed before. So the first paragraph, it says they define acute myocarditis, and then they give an overview of the epidemiology. And then they say how important it is. So it says here that myocarditis, they account for 1/3 of childhood dilated cardiomyopathies, and they are related to sudden cardiac death in these young patients. So they give here, right, the relevance of the disease of the subject, and then they say that the diagnosis of myocarditis is challenging. So this is all about the relevance, right? The statement of the issue. They explain what it is. They said how important it is in terms of epidemiology and what the problem is, right? So diagnosing this important disease, it's hard. So in this first paragraph, they gave the relevance. And then they moved forward to the second paragraph where they introduced the role of MRI, like how important it is to investigate myocarditis. And then they explained the Lake Louise criteria. And then finally, at the end of the second paragraph, they use this the following phrase. They say, previous studies evaluated the performance of cardiac MRI diagnostic parameters primarily in adults, but the diagnostic value of quantitative parameters remains undetermined in children and adolescents. So this remains undetermined is that transitional device, right? We used to introduce the knowledge gap. So this is what is unknown. We don't know if these MRI parameters can be used in children and adolescents. So this is all about the originality, right? What is the need? Why do we need to study? Why do we need to study this? And then finally, the last paragraph of the introduction is the purpose. And here the authors were very straightforward. They just stated the purpose of this study is to evaluate the diagnostic performance and assess the value of MRI as follow-up for the disease. So they went and they were very, very clear. So this is very important. And that's what actually reviewers and editors are looking for when they're reading your paper. So it's all about the purpose. So you should end your introduction with the purpose. So keep in mind, you can write a great introduction with just 3 paragraphs. And that's actually remarkable, right? So moving forward to the discussion section. The discussion section is all about what this study means, right? So you should tell how you interpret your findings and you should synthesize them and also how they impact the field. It's all about kind of merging your introduction and your results, right? So you're gonna the discussion is kind of this interplay between the introduction and your discussion. You're gonna try to address the issues and the questions and the aims that were introduced in the introduction section through your results, right? So you should focus, keep in mind to focus on your results and avoid analyzing too much previous studies. It's all about your paper, your results, right? You should avoid also repeating information from the introduction. It can be, yeah, it's easy to do that. So keep in mind, you should not rewrite your introduction. You should actually you write, answer the questions that you raised in your introduction through your results. So it's all about what the study really means, right? We can just, I will give you an example with like a 5 to 6 paragraph techniques for discussion, where in the first paragraph, you will do a synopsis of the most relevant results. So the first sentence of this paragraph will be, you're going to repeat the purpose of your study. And then in the middle sentence, you're going to introduce your findings. So you're going to say several key findings can be drawn from this study, first this, second that, first that, and last that. And then the last sentence, you're going to answer the specific research question that you asked in the last paragraph of your introduction. And then on the second paragraph, you're going to interpret your own results. So you're going to discuss each finding and emphasize their meaning and originality. So depending on how many research questions you can have multiple of these actually second paragraphs, let's say. You should avoid overstating the significance of your findings and using self-promoting terms. So in general, journals don't like it when you say, oh, we're the first to analyze it, we're the first to ask this question, we're the first. They don't really like it. We should definitely avoid those. And then finally, you should keep in mind that you should interpret your data in the context of previous studies. So what I usually do, I just merge this 2 and 3rd paragraphs into the specific question. So when I put first, second, and third here, so the first finding, I will interpret it and compare it with previous studies in one paragraph. And then the second finding, the same. I will interpret it and compare with previous finding in another paragraph, and so on. So that's another way of doing that. I prefer doing this way that I explained to you guys, but you can also just put everything separately in different paragraphs. You should also keep in mind that we should not ignore negative results, and the discordant results may be your most important findings, so you should definitely keep them inside your paper. And then you should end with the clinical and pathophysiological relevance of your significance of your study, right? So you should discuss the potential impact that your study may have in patient care and in the scientific community as well. And then finally, you should state your limitations. So this is actually interesting. We have a tendency of trying to, we may think at first that we should, that if we don't, how can I say, if we don't describe all the limitations of our study, we may be making it look better in the eyes of reviewers and editors, but actually that's not the case. Editors and reviewers, they are very likely to find flaws in our work. That's their job, right? So if we actually acknowledge that we have limitations and enumerate them all, we're gonna go ahead, we're gonna be ahead of them in a way, right? So we're gonna make it clear that we know the limitations of our study, and we can actually have, and then we actually have the opportunity to actually defend ourselves first. So we can say that, well, we have several limitations, but we did this, and that to try and overcome those limitations. So it's definitely important to state all the potential limitations that you think your manuscript, your study might have, and also do not forget to mention the strengths as well. We should definitely value our work as much as possible. So finally, let's go together through each one of these paragraphs of the discussion in that example. So in here, in the first sentence, right, of the first paragraph of the discussion, which is the synopsis paragraph, we should first state the purpose of the study. So this is what they did. So they, in the first sentence of the discussion section, they say that in this study, we evaluated the diagnostic performance of MRI criteria for myoclonitis in pediatric and adolescent patients. So that's the first. And then on the second and the middle sentences, they stated all their findings, right? So they say the main finding and on the second finding, all the different results they have are enumerated here. And then in the last sentence, we answer the research question that they described in the last paragraph of the discussion, of the introduction, sorry. So they say that, therefore, the use of non-contrast MRI in children may be a viable option in cases where the intravenous contrast is sought to be avoided. So this is kind of a very organized and very structured first paragraph of the discussion. And then the second and third paragraphs, like I mentioned before, you can merge them. And that's what they did as well. So the criteria, the T1 mapping and volume fraction T2 mapping, these are all their results. These are all different variables that they analyzed in their study. So what they did was that for each one of these variables they analyzed, they discussed their findings in light of the results from the literature, right? So they compared what they found before. So in the previous study, in our study, so that's how he analyzed it. This was for each one of their findings. And then finally, they also introduced the significance, the clinical and pathophysiological significance of their study, and they even use a subtitle called clinical correlation for that. So they say, therefore, mapping parameters seem to be a valuable tool to track disease activity or therapeutic response. And then in the last paragraph, the limitation, they also use a subtitle for that, and they just state all the potential limitations. So they say that their study has several limitations: first, second, third, fourth, 5. So they enumerated 5 different limitations. So keep in mind that we should never, we should not avoid stating our limitations. We should be as open as possible in that sense. And then finally, the conclusion paragraph, it should summarize your most relevant findings. And you should also put in there some suggestions for future steps. So do not just list your results. That you kind of already did that in the first paragraph of the discussion. So you should avoid that, redoing that again. You should just provide a clear scientific justification for your work, and try to point out the future experiments that should be undertaken in that field, and also what kind of analyses are already underway. So in here, their conclusion paragraph, but they said they end their manuscript with saying that the Lake Louise criterion have a high performance for the diagnosis of acute myocarditis in children and adolescents, and it should be implemented into routine diagnostic workup. And they say that some mapping parameters might be also particularly useful in tracking inflammatory disease activity. So they end with their by answering their research question and saying how important it is in the field, right? So finally, the abstract. So keep in mind, the abstract should be one of the last things we're actually working on. It should be a brief summary, right? It should be, it can be the only thing the editors and readers will ever read. So make it good, right? Make it appealing, make it so good that they want to read the rest of the article. So it does impact the ability of search engines to search to find out articles as well. Should keep that in mind. And we should form an independent, it should form an independent and standalone unit by itself. So it's usually 150 to 300 words. We should definitely keep it short. We can copy paste from previous sections. It's usually organized into a background statement where we're gonna just state the knowledge graph, the purpose paragraph. We're gonna use usually a single statement, single sentence. The methods should be very concise and they should have just enough so that the reader can actually understand what you did. The results, you're going to keep just the most important findings in there, and then the conclusion, you're going to just give the core message and take-home message of the article. So for instance, here in that example, the background, they just state the knowledge gap, right? So they say that employing this criteria in pediatric patients is with acute myocarditis is undefined. And then the objective is very straightforward as well. It's to evaluate the diagnostic value of this marker, of this criteria. And then in the materials and methods, it's also very straightforward, very few lines where they just explain what kind of analysis they ran, what kind of imaging technique, and what were the criteria they used. And then in the results section, you should keep in mind that you should use put on some statistical results as well, but only the most important findings should be in there. And then for the conclusion section, you should keep in mind that only the core message and the take-home message should be kept in here. So that's exactly what they did. Finally, the title, right? So the title, in general, people say it should be the last thing you do. You should keep in mind that you can begin writing with a working title, but you're going to definitely use the second one later on. We never end up with the same title we started. It should be succinct, direct, and strong. It should capture the attention of potential readers. And they set very strong readers' expectations, right? So based on what your title is, the readers may know already what to expect. We should avoid acronyms or abbreviations in titles, and some nice ideas for titles is like combining two sentences with a column. That's very helpful. Usually when you have to save some words as well, usually titles have word limits that should be followed. You can also use just a positive statement describing your main findings of the study. So for instance, ApoE epsilon 2 and epsilon 4 correlate with increased amyloid accumulation in cerebral vasculature. So this is one example. You can also just cover relevant details of your study, like population pathology and imaging methods. That's another kind of way to build a nice title. So, for instance, in that previous article we've been discussing, what they did is exactly that last suggestion. So they used the imaging method, the population, and the disease they're studying precisely. And the references, we should use definitely the free or commercial reference managing softwares. Those are very, very helpful. We should keep in mind to only provide the most relevant and original references. We should avoid referencing reviews. We should try and cite the most recent references in general. It just shows how up to date your manuscript is. You should format the references, of course, according to the journal's instructions, and you should try also to always respect the reference limits as well. So some final tips. We should try and take very, very good care of our work and present it beautifully. If we don't value it, nobody else will, so we should make it look good. Always try to facilitate for editors and reviewers as well. In terms of language, we should always try to avoid long sentences. As we usually speak Spanish or Portuguese, and we have a tendency of using a lot of subordinate clauses, we should try to avoid it. And also, we should make use of a broad range of transitional devices, as I mentioned before. those words or phrases that we use to actually introduce the knowledge gap, the purpose, and so on. So that's very, very helpful to have like a broad range of that. And yeah, that's all I had to discuss with you guys. I hope that this blank page isn't as frightening as it did before. And of course, this secret of getting ahead is getting started. So I wish you the best of luck in this exciting journey in your new next papers. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions by email. Feel free to shoot me an email anytime. Thank you so much for your time.